Our Professor Richard Wolff is with us, the economist, professor of economics, in fact, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, author of numerous books. His most recent, now available as an ebook as well, The Sickness is the System When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. Democracyatwork.info, RD Wolff with 2Fs.com, and you can tweet him at Prof. Wolff with 2Fs. Dr. Wolff, welcome back to the program. I'm reading this article in the Fiscal Times, in which Janet Yellen says that at the end of next month, the end of July, Congress is going to have to raise the debt ceiling. This is something that goes back to the 50s, as I recall, one of the periodic Republican hysterias about national debt. And if they fail to raise that debt ceiling, it will be, to use her word, this is the Treasury Secretary, catastrophic. Can you give us a kind of Econ 101? What is the debt ceiling? Why does it matter? How would it be catastrophic? And why are Republicans playing political games with this?
Yes, it's a kind of recurring story, excuse me, in American history, particularly the last couple of decades. Okay, first of all, the debt ceiling. That is a limit put on by the Congress of the United States, limiting the total amount of money that the federal government can borrow. And remember that the federal government borrows when its objective of spending money involves more money than it raises in taxes. Just like if you and I want to spend more than we earn in our income, we'd have to borrow it. Well, the same with the government. It has to borrow. The unusual thing is it mostly borrows from American companies and American individuals, and indeed from other branches of the American government, that is the Treasury, which keeps these records. In order for the country to work, it steadily runs deficits. It has been doing that for many, many decades. In the last few years, particularly the 20 years of this century, it's been running much larger deficits because our economy is in deep trouble, and the government is called upon to bail out the private capitalist sector over and over again, particularly in the years 2000, 2008, and 2020, because those were the years of the crashes that have been big in this century. And so the government has been borrowing like crazy, and no more than particularly in the last, I would say, few months since the COVID, because it made everything worse. To put a limit on it is to say that the government can't continue to borrow. Why is it catastrophic? Because the only way the government can pay back all the people it borrowed from in the past is if it continues to borrow. The alternative would be to tax the American people to pay back all those that we owe, and that would involve a tax increase that would bring the American economy to a screeching halt. So that's why it's catastrophic to imagine that that limit that has to be regularly extended, and last time was extended 2 years ago, or suspended one way or the other, if you make that limit apply, if you literally limit the government's ability to borrow money, then it would have to use taxes to repay the debt and indeed to do anything else it does, and we don't have an economy that could survive that. That's, by the way, an index of to what extent the private capitalist system of the United States is now literally on life support from the government. Any notion that we have a private system that is somehow independent of or superior to or free from the government is laughable. And this is another illustration of how desperate this society has become on the government's largesse, and in this case, the government's ability to borrow. Why do the Republicans threaten? Because, of course, if a collapse happened, and it happened under a Democratic president, it might provide an opportunity for the Republicans to suggest somehow that it's a Democrat's fault and or to suggest that they could do better. That's also laughable, since they would have exactly the same problem and would have had exactly the same demand on the Congress to lift the limit. But, you know, they might sneak into power that way by playing that kind of game, and that's probably why they're tempted to do so.
So, and if the debt ceiling does not get raised, what's the catastrophe that Janet Yellen is warning about?
Well, the first thing that would happen is an enormous number of people who have in their possession, and I'm talking here about foreign governments, I'm talking about banks, insurance companies, wealthy people, the kind of folks who lend to the federal government, they would begin to worry that the government cannot pay them back. Suppose you're sitting on a bond you lent to the government 20 years ago. It's due to be paid off, I don't know, in September of this year. You read in the newspaper that they can't borrow any more money, and how are they going to pay you back? How are they going to give you back the $10 billion that they owe you? Normally, they would simply go in and borrow it again, pay off whoever wants to be paid off, and replace them with the new borrowing. If you block the new borrowing, all those people sitting on those bonds right now that are coming due over the next month or the next year, it doesn't matter, would suddenly be worried about their assets, and they would sell those bonds, and they might sell them for a very low price, and that would jack up interest rates. And there goes the American economy, because it's dependent on interest rates virtually near zero, and all of that would be out the window.
Now, my recollection is the half a dozen times or so since the 90s when Newt Gingrich pioneered this as a club to beat Democrats up with, this idea of not raising the debt ceiling or shutting down the government as a consequence of that, that the government has had to say, well, if we can't raise the debt ceiling, we not only can't pay back our bondholders, our treasury holders, but we also can't pay our Social Security checks, or we can't pay our government employees, or we're going to have to shut down the national parks. I'm assuming that sort of thing would also be in the works if the Republicans try to block any effort to raise the debt ceiling?
Absolutely. If they do it, if the government can't borrow, then it would have to either raise taxes to pay off whatever it has to buy, or it has to declare a default on those debts that it has. And either of those options would catastrophically damage the American economy. Mm-hmm. And the Republicans are not going to do it, I wouldn't guess. It's usually a bluff. It's designed to give them some talking points and get them some headlines, because if they actually did it, the risk would be that the Democrats could show the people that the catastrophe was not their fault, but the fault of the Republicans, and that may make it backfire on them. So in the end, my guess is this is political theater, and it will not go to the last step. And I think what Mr. Gingrich and the Republicans learned when they've done it in the past is that the net outcome for them hasn't been so good.
Yeah. One last question here. The Axios newsletter is reporting that share buybacks are about to roar into being as a big thing again. This is giant corporations buying their own stock off the stock market. In a minute or two, can you summarize why, and this is a practice that was illegal before the Reagan administration. Can you summarize why corporations do this and what it means to the average person?
Yes, there are basically two reasons that corporations do it. Number one, it's the most profitable thing for them to do with their money. The economy is in such bad shape that producing more goods and services is not an option. The people of this country don't have the wages and can no longer borrow to buy what these companies could produce if they invested their money. So they can't find a profitable outlet the normal way. So here's option number two: buy back your own stock. And why is that attractive? Because when you do that, you retire a bunch of stock that used to be held by the public that you can now erase because you bought them back, which means that whatever the profits your company earns, when you divide it by the number of shares outstanding, there's more profits for each remaining shareholder because you have bought back the stocks from other shareholders. So it looks good for those who remain. And there is a third reason, ugly but there. Many corporations now pay their executives with shares. And if you can drive up the value of the shares in the market by buying back your own, it's a way for the executive to use the money of the company to boost the prices of the shares and thereby get a bigger pay package because their pay is linked to the stock value on the stock market. It's an ugly, self-serving game, but it is absolutely part of the story.